High above the shimmering Pacific, the first streaks of dawn painted the Mariana skies in pale gold and violet. The roar of 20 B-29 superfortresses pierced the fragile calm, each one carrying its deadly cargo toward the heart of Japan. Far below, the sprawling urban expanse of Tokyo stirred, unaware of the approaching storm. Then, slicing through the clouds like silver arrows, came the P-51 Mustangs, their engines screaming and exhaust glinting in the rising sun. Japanese pilots, scanning the skies for lone bombers, blinked in disbelief at the sudden appearance of these long-range escorts, machines they had thought confined to distant battlefields. The Mustangs dove, weaved, and struck with uncanny precision, shattering formations and shaking nerves hardened by years of war. For the first time, the tide of air supremacy shifted, and the mighty city above was no longer untouchable, as American pilots forged a path of speed, fire, and inevitability. By late 1944, the air war over Japan had reached a turning point. The B-29 superfortress, a marvel of American engineering, had begun its campaign from the newly captured Mariana Islands, flying missions that stretched across 1,500 miles of ocean and sky. Initially, these massive bombers were vulnerable, stripped of fighter escort due to the extreme distances involved. Japanese radar and observation posts detected the approaching formations, and fighter squadrons scrambled to intercept. Pilots in nimble Mitsubishi Ki-67s and Nakajima Ki-84s soared toward the high-flying intruders, their guns blazing and engines screaming. Yet they struggled to reach the altitude and maintain pace with the B-29s. Losses mounted on both sides, and a strategic solution became urgent. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang, adapted for long-range missions with drop tanks, changed everything. These fighters, capable of matching the B-29's altitude and speed, could now accompany the bombers on their entire journey to Tokyo and back. On a crisp November morning, formations of P-51s cut through the clouds with an almost predatory grace, their silver fuselages reflecting the sunlight like molten steel. Bomber crews, long accustomed to the terror of solo flights over enemy territory, felt a surge of relief as the familiar roar of Mustang engines joined the steady drone of the superfortresses. Every turn of a Mustang's propeller symbolized not only protection, but a psychological shift in the air war, a new dominance that Japanese pilots had not anticipated. The Japanese defenders had grown confident, their early victories against unescorted B-29s breeding a sense of invulnerability. Reports from squadron leaders noted their astonishment when P-51s appeared at high altitudes, attacking with lethal efficiency. Dogfights erupted in the skies above Tokyo, tracers stitching silver lines across clouds, the thunder of cannon fire echoing over the city below. Japanese pilots found themselves outmatched in speed, maneuverability, and altitude, forced into defensive maneuvers they had rarely practiced. Meanwhile, the strategic planners in Washington and the Mariana bases monitored every sortie with meticulous calculation, knowing that each mission not only destroyed targets on the ground, but also eroded the morale and cohesion of Japan's air defenses. The combination of B-29 payloads and P-51 escorts created a dual threat. Bombers rained fire on industrial and military targets, while fighters cut through any resistance, ensuring higher survival rates and mission success. Crews described the sight of Mustangs breaking formation to intercept Japanese interceptors as both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Smoke plumes, tracer fire, and the hiss of exhausted engines filled the sky, painting a vivid portrait of modern aerial warfare. The Japanese were forced to rethink strategies, dispersing fighters and adjusting altitude. But the sheer range and speed of the P-51 escorts made traditional tactics nearly obsolete. This first wave of escorted raids marked a turning point, signaling that the Japanese home islands were no longer beyond reach. From the Mariana Islands to the heart of Tokyo, American air power now moved with unrelenting precision, demonstrating not only technological superiority but also a new psychological edge. The skies above Japan, once a zone of cautious engagement for defenders, had become a proving ground where the Mustang and Superfortress dictated the tempo, the danger, and the inevitability of victory. As 1945 began, the scale of the air campaign intensified. The B-29 raids, once sporadic and experimental, now unfolded with relentless regularity, striking factories, rail yards, and urban centers with unprecedented precision. The Japanese had invested heavily in early warning systems, anti-aircraft batteries, and fighter command posts. Yet every mission exposed the growing limits of their defenses. Radar stations tracked the advancing formations, alerting scramble teams of Nakajima Ki-84s and Mitsubishi J-2Ms. But their interception windows shrank with each successive raid. Every sortie tested endurance, skill, and the ability to anticipate the enemy in a war that had become increasingly dominated by technological reach and speed. The P-51 Mustang, already legendary in the European theater, proved equally transformative in the Pacific. With drop tanks extending operational range beyond 1,500 miles, pilots could escort the bombers from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam all the way to the Tokyo industrial belt and return without refueling. The long flights demanded acute vigilance. Engines whined at high altitudes, oxygen systems hissed, and the thin air carried the scent of fuel and the metallic tang of overworked machinery. Japanese radar detected these small, gleaming silhouettes slicing through the sky, often before bomber formations themselves were spotted. Pilots recalled the sudden clarity of the Mustang's appearance, a flash of silver that defied expectations and forced immediate reaction. Japanese pilots, many with extensive combat experience in China and the Pacific Islands, were unprepared for the Mustang's combination of speed, maneuverability, and endurance. Encounters often began with a surprise. A formation of B-29s seemed vulnerable, only for a wall of P-51s to descend from above, weaving between cloud layers, machine guns and cannons cutting deadly arcs through the sky. The air filled with smoke trails, tracer rounds, and the constant roar of engines as dogfights erupted. Strategic bombing had now become a coordinated ballet of destruction, with Mustang pilots anticipating enemy maneuvers while protecting fragile bomber formations, often over hundreds of miles of open sky. The psychological effect on Japanese aircrews was profound. Reports and diaries from the time describe confusion, disbelief, and demoralization as the long-range escorts dismantled previously effective tactics. Pilots struggled to maintain altitude and cohesion against the relentless pressure, while anti-aircraft gunners found targets fleeting and unpredictable. The combination of heavy bomber payloads and protective Mustangs meant that losses for Japanese fighters increased sharply, while bomber attrition declined. Every successful escort reinforced the perception of an unstoppable air presence, signaling a new era of American strategic dominance. By spring 1945, the escorted raids were no longer anomalies, but standard operations. Tokyo and other industrial hubs braced for incoming strikes, with city air defenses stretched thin and exhausted. The P-51s had not only extended American reach, but had also altered the psychological battlefield, eroding the confidence of pilots who had previously believed their home skies secure. Each mission demonstrated that technology, planning, and precision could overwhelm even the most seasoned defenders, turning the Pacific Air War into a relentless contest of endurance, skill, and industrial might. The first angle of this campaign was technological supremacy. a mastery of speed, range, and firepower that Japanese pilots had never encountered at such altitude and scale. The P-51 Mustang, light yet durable, with its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, could reach speeds over 430 miles per hour and maintain operational ceilings above 30,000 feet. Drop tanks extended this range, transforming the fighter into a long-distance predator capable of crossing the vast expanse of the Pacific. For bomber crews, this meant escort cover that stretched from takeoff to target and back, a shield of roaring metal against intercepting fighters. The contrast was stark. Japanese aircraft, though agile, lacked both the altitude endurance and the sustained firepower to challenge these escorts effectively. The second angle lay in tactics and coordination. Mission planning was meticulous, with American intelligence mapping Japanese radar coverage, fighter bases, and anti-aircraft batteries. Mustangs flew in layered formations, alternating positions to intercept enemy fighters before they could reach vulnerable B-29s. Bombers themselves maintained disciplined formations, their defensive guns covering all vectors, while the escorting P-51s patrolled the outer perimeter with lethal precision. The choreography was precise. One misstep could expose a bomber to concentrated attack, but when executed perfectly, the combination of fighter cover and bomber firepower rendered the Japanese response nearly impotent. From a human perspective, these missions demanded extraordinary endurance and focus. Pilots climbed to extreme altitudes, the air thin and biting, requiring oxygen masks and constant attention to instrument panels. Hours passed in a tension-filled silence, broken only by the distant rattle of anti-aircraft fire or the sudden screech of enemy aircraft. Crew diaries described the blend of awe and terror as the Mustang escorts appeared like sudden silver phantoms, diving from above with an almost supernatural timing. Japanese pilots, facing these unrelenting protectors, were often forced into defensive spirals, climbing and diving to avoid cannon fire. Their skills strained to the limits by machines that could match their every maneuver. Strategic impact formed the third angle. The mere presence of long-range P-51s shifted Japanese defensive priorities, forcing a redistribution of fighters, the alteration of patrol schedules, and the strengthening of anti-aircraft networks that were already stretched thin. Industrial output, particularly in Tokyo, faced interruptions as factories adjusted to blackout procedures and defensive dispersal, while trained pilots faced higher attrition rates. The combination of bomber payloads and fighter escort meant that strategic objectives were increasingly achieved with minimal American losses, demonstrating a synergy between technological advantage and operational planning that had long-term consequences for the Pacific theater. Finally, the psychological dimension cannot be overstated. Surprise and fear rippled through Japanese squadrons, creating hesitation and miscalculations in the air. Reports from intercepted communications revealed disbelief at the presence of fighters where none had been expected, a realization that American air power now reached into the heart of Japan with precision and protection. The P-51s were more than machines. They were symbols of inescapable reach, of a changing war where the skies above Japan were no longer safe, and the balance of power had decisively tilted. The second angle emphasizes the operational evolution and adaptability of American air forces in the Pacific, a lesson in logistics, planning, and innovation under pressure. Early B-29 missions had revealed critical vulnerabilities. Unescorted bombers faced severe attrition from fighters and flak, while navigation across vast ocean distances strained crews and maintenance teams. Engineers, pilots, and strategists collaborated to address these challenges, producing long-range P-51s, refining formation flying, and integrating intelligence from reconnaissance and code-breaking. Each mission became a demonstration of cumulative knowledge applied in real time. with every sortie feeding data into the next, sharpening tactics, and improving survivability. Weather played a constant, unpredictable role. High-altitude winds, cloud layers, and the thin, biting air at 30,000 feet tested both aircraft and crew. Pilots spoke of the surreal clarity above the clouds, the sun glinting on silver wings, juxtaposed with the violent chaos that could erupt in an instant. Tracers arced across the sky, engines roared in unison, and distant flak bursts erupted like unnatural thunder. In this environment, coordination between bomber and escort was essential. A single Mustang breaking formation at the wrong moment could leave a bomber exposed to enemy attack. Yet when the formation moved as one, the effect was overwhelming. Japanese interceptors struggled to penetrate the protective screen, often forced into futile maneuvers under sustained cannon and machine gun fire. The third dimension of this angle is the human toll and endurance required for these operations. Missions lasting over 12 hours pushed physical and mental limits. Pilots endured hypoxia risks, engine vibrations, and relentless vigilance against both mechanical failure and enemy action. Bomber crews, once accustomed to solitary flight over hostile skies, felt a mixture of awe, reassurance, and tension as Mustangs patrolled overhead. The psychological weight on Japanese pilots was equally stark. Confronted with these long-range escorts, they had to reimagine combat strategies, climbing higher, diving faster, or withdrawing entirely in ways that disrupted cohesion and morale. Diaries and after-action reports capture this combination of fear, surprise, and the stark realization of being technologically outmatched. From a strategic perspective, the escorted raids reshaped Japanese defensive doctrine. Squadrons were reallocated, patrols adjusted, and anti-aircraft deployments spread thinner. The synergy of B-29 payloads and P-51 cover meant that air losses decreased for Americans while Japanese attrition grew, a dynamic that extended beyond isolated missions to influence the larger air campaign over Honshu. Industrial output, particularly in Tokyo, increasingly suffered interruptions as the presence of bombers and escorts forced operational slowdowns, blackout enforcement, and dispersal of key facilities. Ultimately, the combination of technology, planning, and human resilience produced a tactical and psychological dominance that left Japanese pilots stunned and defensive structures strained. The escorting Mustangs not only protected bombers, but redefined air combat over Japan, proving that distance was no barrier and that coordination, speed, and surprise could dictate outcomes as decisively as raw firepower. The skies above Tokyo had transformed into a stage where American air power orchestrated destruction with precision, leaving an indelible mark on both the defenders and the course of the war. November 1944 brought one of the first fully escorted raids deep into the Tokyo industrial belt, a mission that would redefine aerial warfare over Japan. As dawn broke over the Mariana Islands, crews of B-29 superfortresses filed into formation, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Clouds hung low in some areas, scattering the sunlight into pale beams across the ocean, while others reflected the rising sun in molten gold. Mustangs, pre-positioned and fueled for the extended journey, roared to life, slicing through the atmosphere with a precision honed by hours of training and reconnaissance. Every aircraft, every crew, was acutely aware that this mission was a test of endurance, skill, and coordination. The Japanese defenders scrambled upon detection. Radar stations blipped with incoming formations, and the familiar cadence of scrambling fighters filled the airwaves. Mitsubishi J-2Ms and Nakajima Ki-84s surged upward, engines screaming, climbing toward the B-29s with practiced efficiency. What they did not anticipate was the sudden appearance of P-51 Mustangs from above, their silver fuselages gleaming in the weak morning light. For a moment, The Japanese pilots faltered, scanning the sky, adjusting to the unexpected. Then, the engagement erupted. Tracer rounds stitched arcs through clouds, engines screamed under strain, and the thin Pacific air carried the thunder of cannon fire. Bomber crews, peering from plexiglass noses and gunner positions, witnessed a scene both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Mustangs dove, weaved, and struck with terrifying precision, intercepting fighters before they could reach the bombers' vulnerable paths. Smoke trails and tracer fire crisscrossed the sky, and flak bursts from Japanese anti-aircraft batteries added a jagged rhythm of explosion. Every maneuver was calculated, every dive or climb measured in seconds, as pilots exploited altitude, speed, and tactical discipline. Japanese airmen, forced into defensive spirals and evasive maneuvers, realized their training and experience were insufficient against this new paradigm of escort warfare. As the B-29s approached their targets, the effectiveness of the Mustang screen became evident. Japanese defensive formations were scattered, communications scrambled, and several fighters forced to retreat or crash under sustained pressure. Bombers released payloads of incendiaries and high explosives, turning factories into smoke-choked infernos. The roar of detonations rose from Tokyo, mingling with the whine of engines and the hiss of spent flak shells, creating a layered soundtrack of destruction. Crews documented the surreal combination of awe, fear, and grim satisfaction at the sight of strategic objectives achieved with precision, while casualties among their formations remained relatively low. The Mustang pilots maintained cover through the return leg, exploiting knowledge of enemy positions and historical flight paths. Japanese fighters, many low on fuel and ammunition, attempted last-ditch intercepts, but were systematically countered. Exhausted crews of both bombers and fighters emerged from the skies over Tokyo, each mission etching new lessons into the playbook of aerial warfare. The psychological blow to Japanese Air Command was immediate. The notion that American bombers could be struck deep into the heart of the homeland while remaining under continuous, lethal escort challenged doctrine, morale, and the perception of invulnerability. The return flight was no less perilous, but the P-51s held firm, slicing through the thinning clouds like guardians of steel. Exhaust fumes mingled with the cold, rarefied air at 30,000 feet, and pilots fought fatigue, hypoxia, and the constant vigilance required to maintain formation. Japanese interceptors, though diminished, attempted sporadic attacks, diving from cloud cover with desperate aggression. Every engagement was a test of reflexes, timing, and tactical discipline. The Mustangs intercepted with uncanny precision, forcing enemy aircraft into evasive spirals, often driving them into anti-aircraft fire or sending them tumbling to the sea. Below, Tokyo was left smoldering. Fires consumed factories, railway yards, and industrial complexes, sending plumes of black smoke twisting skyward. The distant thunder of falling bombs still reverberated in the ears of returning crews, and the city appeared both familiar and transformed. A landscape reshaped by calculated destruction. The B-29s, flying in tight formations, remained largely unscathed thanks to the relentless Mustang screen. Pilots and gunners scanned the skies, alert for any remaining threats. Yet the Japanese resistance had been decisively weakened. The psychological impact on both sides was stark. American crews felt a mix of relief, exhaustion, and grim accomplishment, the hours-long tension leaving a deep imprint. Diaries described the surreal juxtaposition of calm above the clouds and chaos below, the sunlight reflecting off silver wings while the city burned beneath. Japanese pilots, conversely, confronted the terrifying reality of an air campaign in which traditional strategies and home-ground familiarity offered little protection. Reports from squadron leaders note confusion disbelief, and the dawning recognition that American air power could now penetrate deep into Japanese territory with impunity. Strategically, the raid reinforced the efficacy of long-range fighter escort. Commanders in the Mariana bases meticulously analyzed the engagement, noting Mustang kill counts, bomber losses, and timing efficiencies. Each sortie became a data point, informing subsequent missions and fine-tuning tactics. Escort formations adapted, shifting positions to maximize coverage, while Japanese defensive deployment required constant adjustment. The combined weight of technological superiority, operational planning, and pilot skill ensured that American bombing campaigns grew increasingly effective, while Japanese interception capabilities dwindled under relentless pressure. The engagement also signaled a broader shift in the air war over Japan. The introduction of continuous long-range escort made the once precarious mission survivable, allowing B-29 crews to strike industrial and military targets with confidence. Japanese air defense had to contend not only with the destructive payloads of the superfortresses, but with the persistent, punishing presence of the P-51s. This dual threat, destruction from above and interception denial, reshaped the tactical and psychological battlefield. It became clear that the American air campaign could sustain high-intensity operations, gradually eroding Japan's industrial capacity and morale, while reducing the losses that had plagued earlier, unescorted raids. By the time the formations touched down on Saipan, pilots and crews carried the weight of history. They had flown into the heart of Japan, confronted enemy forces, and returned largely intact. The success demonstrated the culmination of engineering, planning, and human endurance. A decisive moment where skill, technology, and strategy coalesced to dominate the skies and shift the trajectory of the Pacific War. The immediate aftermath of the escorted raids reverberated across the Pacific and within the Japanese homeland. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam became hubs of meticulous debriefing, maintenance, and tactical analysis. B-29 crews filed into briefing rooms, still smelling of aviation fuel, sweat, and smoke, recounting hours of tension as Mustangs sliced through the high-altitude expanse, intercepting enemy fighters with lethal efficiency. Maintenance teams worked feverishly, repairing engines, replacing hydraulic lines, and inspecting airframes, ensuring that the next sortie could launch on schedule. Each plane represented not only a technological marvel, but a critical component of a carefully orchestrated strategy that sought to systematically dismantle Japan's industrial and psychological defenses. Japanese command faced a harsher reality. Reports from fighter squadrons documented the growing attrition among pilots, the stress of constant interception attempts, and the failure of traditional tactics against the long-range Mustang escorts. Diaries and post-mission analyses reveal a pervasive sense of disbelief and anxiety. Squadrons that had previously been confident in their ability to defend Tokyo now confronted the sobering reality that the airspace above their own capital was no longer a domain they could control. Every successful raid reinforced the perception of American technological and operational superiority, reshaping defensive priorities and forcing reallocations of both pilots and aircraft. The physical consequences for Tokyo were immediate. Fires from incendiary raids spread rapidly through industrial districts, black smoke rising to mingle with the high-altitude clouds that had been witness to the dogfights below. Rail lines, factories, and warehouses suffered crippling damage, disrupting supply chains and delaying production. Engineers and factory workers scrambled to repair machinery and continue operations under the constant threat of further attacks. The psychological impact on civilians was equally profound. The once distant threat of air raids had now arrived in full force, carried on the wings of both B-29s and their agile, protective P-51's escorts. Within the American command structure, analysis of the first fully escorted missions informed subsequent operational planning. Intelligence officers compiled detailed reports on enemy fighter performance, altitude capabilities, and likely response patterns. These data points guided adjustments in formation tactics, timing of bomb release, and positioning of Mustangs. Coordination between bomber and fighter squadrons became increasingly seamless. Pilots developed an intuitive understanding of their roles. The Mustangs patrolled the perimeter, anticipating attacks. The B-29 gunners maintained disciplined fire, and navigators calculated wind, altitude, and enemy positions with precision. The symbiosis of technology, training, and tactical discipline ensured that the efficacy of future raids would only grow. The human toll among Japanese pilots was significant. Engagements with Mustangs frequently forced maneuvers that exceeded structural limits of their aircraft, resulting in mechanical failures and crashes. Fatigue mounted from repeated high-altitude missions, and morale deteriorated as the realization of American dominance sank in. Strategic planners scrambled to redistribute squadrons and revise patrol schedules. But the logistical strain proved immense. The Japanese Air Command increasingly faced the dilemma of sending underprepared pilots into encounters that they were unlikely to survive, further eroding both effectiveness and morale. Conversely, American crews, while fatigued and often exposed to extreme physical stress, emerged with a reinforced sense of purpose and capability. The presence of long-range escorts reduced losses dramatically compared to earlier missions, instilling confidence and a tangible sense of operational superiority. Diaries from Mustang pilots capture the almost surreal experience of diving through sunlit clouds, engaging enemy fighters with precision, and witnessing the destructive effectiveness of combined arms, the coordination of strategic bombing and fighter protection. These experiences would shape operational doctrine, emphasizing the psychological as well as tactical dimensions of air power. The larger strategic implications became immediately apparent. The successful integration of long-range fighter escort effectively nullified Japan's once formidable air defense buffer over the home islands. Industrial targets, previously considered partially protected by the difficulty of reaching them, now lay within range of sustained, coordinated attacks. The dual threat of precise bombing and lethal fighter coverage forced Japanese command to reevaluate both defensive and logistical planning. Entire squadrons were repositioned, anti-aircraft emplacements modified, and radar networks expanded. Yet the fundamental imbalance in technology and operational flexibility remained. The long-term effects of these escorted raids quickly became evident across the Pacific theater. The B-29 campaigns, bolstered by the P-51 Mustang's unprecedented range and speed, systematically degraded Japan's capacity to wage war from its home islands. Strategic objectives were no longer hypothetical or aspirational. Factories producing aircraft engines, ball bearings, and munitions were destroyed or disrupted, crippling the nation's war-making infrastructure. Every sortie reinforced the lesson that Japanese defenses, no matter how well prepared, could be penetrated with precision and sustained pressure. Smoke from fires lingered in the high-altitude winds, a constant reminder to both crews and commanders that their actions were reshaping the physical and psychological landscape of the conflict. Japanese pilots faced a grim reality. Casualty reports, intercepted communications, and post-mission diaries document the escalating toll. Experienced veterans, once confident in their altitude advantage and maneuverability, found themselves outmatched by the combination of speed, endurance, and tactical discipline exhibited by the P-51 escorts. Each engagement imposed physical and mental strain. Repeated high-altitude flights, evasive maneuvers under fire, and the constant threat of sudden Mustang attacks left many pilots exhausted before the mission's end. The attrition of skilled aviators compounded the difficulties of maintaining cohesive defensive formations, forcing rapid training and deployment of less experienced pilots who were often ill-prepared for the intensity of modern aerial combat. American forces, by contrast, leveraged the success of these missions to refine doctrine and expand operational reach. Intelligence officers meticulously analyzed sortie reports, mapping Japanese defensive patterns, timing intercepts, and calculating optimal formations. Every detail, engine performance, altitude fluctuations, weather conditions, and enemy reactions, fed into planning for the next mission. Crews developed near-instinctual coordination. Mustangs patrolled high and low, covering blind spots. B-29 gunners fired with disciplined timing. Navigators adjusted for wind shear and altitude variations. The cumulative effect was a formidable air presence, a combination of technology and human skill that systematically overwhelmed Japan's capacity to resist. The psychological consequences were equally profound. Civilians in Tokyo and other urban centers endured increasing anxiety as raids intensified. The city skyline, once distant and untouchable, was repeatedly marred by smoke, fire, and the echo of distant explosions. The presence of P-51s, visible as gleaming silhouettes high above the bombers, amplified the sense of inescapable reach. For Japanese pilots, the skies were no longer a familiar environment, but a domain dominated by an adversary with superior range, firepower, and coordination. Reports note hesitation, confusion, and rapid recalibration of tactics, as traditional defensive measures proved increasingly ineffective. Industrial and military planners within Japan scrambled to mitigate losses. Factories were dispersed, blackout protocols tightened, and fighter squadrons redeployed in desperate attempts to protect key assets. Yet these measures offered only partial relief. The technological and operational edge of the Americans remained insurmountable. Every successful mission demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of integrating strategic bombing with fighter escort, highlighting the critical interplay between air power, intelligence, and logistics. The success of escorted raids also informed broader Allied strategy. Commanders recognized that long-range fighter support could be a decisive force multiplier, reducing bomber losses while maximizing destruction of strategic targets. The lessons learned over the Mariana Islands informed subsequent operations across the Pacific, including raids on industrial hubs in northern Honshu and Kakushu. Coordination between bomber and escort became a model of efficiency, emphasizing timing, altitude management, and defensive coverage that would be studied in air academies for decades. By mid-1945, the cumulative effect of these operations had shifted the strategic calculus. Japan's industrial output had slowed, air defense morale had waned, and the psychological weight of inescapable American air power dominated planning. The dual impact of bomber payloads and Mustang escort coverage had not only destroyed critical infrastructure, but also reshaped the perception of invulnerability that had once emboldened Japanese pilots. The skies above Japan were no longer merely contested. They were decisively controlled by an enemy whose reach and coordination redefined the parameters of modern aerial warfare. The escorted B-29 raids over Japan exemplify a turning point in the Pacific Air War, where technology, strategy, and human endurance converged to reshape the battlefield. The P-51 Mustang, once confined to European skies, demonstrated that range and speed could redefine operational possibilities, allowing bombers to strike deep into enemy territory with unprecedented protection. For Japanese pilots, the sudden appearance of these long-range escorts shattered assumptions about airspace control and exposed vulnerabilities that had been underestimated for years. Beyond the physical destruction of factories, rail lines, and industrial complexes, The raids imposed a profound psychological toll. Civilians and military personnel alike confronted the reality that distance no longer guaranteed safety, and that the skies above Tokyo were dominated by a foe capable of both precision and persistence. The synergy between bomber payload and fighter cover highlighted the evolution of air power as a holistic tool, where technology, tactics, and coordination could achieve results far greater than any single element alone. These operations also underscore the interplay between human skill and mechanical innovation. Pilots endured extreme fatigue, high-altitude hazards, and relentless stress, yet their discipline and coordination amplified the impact of superior aircraft. Meanwhile, the Japanese defensive response, constrained by technological and logistical limits, revealed the vulnerability of even experienced aviators when confronted with rapid innovation. The escorted raids over Tokyo thus stand as a testament to the transformative power of strategic planning, engineering excellence, and human perseverance. A moment where air superiority, meticulously executed, reshaped both the course of the conflict and the very perception of what was possible in modern warfare.